So the last time that we were together and lectured, we talked about kind of the beginnings of World War I, how we kind of got there. And so in this lesson, we're going to look at the Great War, but we're going to focus a little bit more on the experiences of the people who actually lived through the war from 1914 to 1918. So if you take a moment and I'm actually missing a slide there, but let me see if I can actually find that real quick, because I know that I have it. My bad. So this picture was actually originally in black and white. And interestingly enough, that there's this big effort, and a lot of this has been done now. And in fact, there's stuff that the History Channel did that they did an entire documentary series, several hours, where it was actually the World War I in color, where they basically took all the old videos, all the old pictures, and colorized them, so you could kind of see what this war would have looked like in color. It was super interesting, and there's been this effort to do this. But if you look at this picture in black and white, you can't really see it as much. But this picture, what do you notice about these guys? I mean, look at this kid. Look at this guy. These guys. I mean, these guys are very young, okay? This is the 1st Battalion Hertfordshire Regiment in Berkhamsted, Hertfordshire, England, during summer camp in July 1914. These soldiers are extremely young. 17, 18, you're supposed to be 18, but you had people that, particularly in England, after they were bombed and attacked and World War I gets started, you have people like 14 years old going to join the army and going to fight in World War I. 14-year-olds. Like freshmen in high school, 8th graders. Signing up and going to shoot people in Germany and going to fight on the front lines. And so it really puts it in perspective that when we talk about how many people die in this war and how brutal and how terrible this war was, it really does put it in perspective about who is fighting this war, and kind of gives you that connection point there. Again, we talked about how the Germans had this plan called the Schlieffen Plan, and the idea was that they would attack France before they would turn around and then meet Russia. And it was successful, that they wouldn't have to fight a war on two fronts. And so one of the first major showdowns between France and Germany comes at a place called the First Battle of Marne in September of 1914. And the French put up a very good military defensive line around Paris, so they're able to actually stop the Germans. And really, that was because the Belgians had actually slowed the German advance quite a bit. The Germans were expecting to just roll through Belgium in a couple of days, but instead the Belgians had put up such a massive amount of resistance that it took a lot longer for the Germans to get through the Belgian territory than they expected. And so the French are scrambling to get their troops to the front line so that they can actually, fight the Germans as they get to France. And you can see here that, this is in a World War I museum. They start actually recruiting taxi cabs from Paris so they're using taxi cabs to transport soldiers basically to the front lines from all over the city and from the country. And so they're trying to get them in place. And all this scrambling was very successful. The French do stop the Germans from taking Paris. And because of that, we see a shift in the nature of this war to what's known as the Western Front, because the Germans are stopped from actually taking Paris. Now, when the French set up their defenses, they actually start to dig in, quite literally dig in. And the French and British dig along this Western Front here, and we can see that they construct about 400 miles of trenches. And really, for most of the war, you see that the fighting is basically all going to take place here on this Western Front of this line. And you can see that in 1916, basically in the middle of the war, this is the line, this dotted line that I'm kind of following here. All of the darker area here is basically the Western, or the battlefields from 1916 to 1918. So almost exclusively around where that trench line is dug. And so it becomes more of a defensive struggle for the most part. There's not a whole lot of offense that is going to take place during this war. So what is trench warfare? Well, when we read soldiers' letters, we find that it was very not a pleasant experience to be in the trenches. They're basically just dug out of the ground. The Germans were a little bit better at it than the French and the British were. And you can see some of the Australian soldiers here in a trench on the right-hand side of the screen here. Notice that it's really just a long hole in the ground, not really well dug out, just enough where you could kind of not get shot by machine guns. Germans did, like I said, a little bit better. They tended to dig out bunkers and have sleeping chambers, and they would kind of dig out under the ground, much nicer than the British and the French did. But even so, the German trench lines, whenever it rains, they would basically turn to mud pits, mud holes. And if you know anything about Europe, Northern Europe in particular, you got quite a bit of rain there, and it would just turn into this mud pit. So you're sitting in this trench, you can't get out because you'll get shot, and it's raining, and there's rats, and there's lice, and there's disease, and you're sitting in ankle-deep mud. You had people that ended up getting what was called trench foot, and that's where essentially their feet would get so wet and stay wet for so long that you know how your hands get wrinkly. Have you ever seen anybody that had their foot like wet for way, way, way too long? No. It's pretty bad. Like, have any of you ever had like a bandage that was wrapped around your leg and then you left it on there for too long? Like, your doctor told you to like, oh, take it off every now and then you were like, I'm just gonna leave it on there, and then after like 3 days you take it off and it's like white underneath and it's like disgusting. Imagine that for a month. Like, quite literally, it gets so, the foot absorbs and so much water and your skin absorbs so much water, it basically becomes like you can almost just peel it off the skin. It's really bad because you're just sitting in mud for months on end. It was really kind of miserable. But they didn't really have much of a choice because of some of the new technologies that were invented, made trench warfare really the only way to stay alive. The defensive technology had not quite caught up to the offensive technology. And so, I mean, you have things like barbed wire and stuff like this that was set up across, from the trenches, so that even if you got out of the trench and you tried to storm the other trench, you'd have to go through barbed wire and landmines and face machine guns that were insanely, efficient at killing. And so, this guy, he gets hung up in the barbed wire and he can't get through, and then they just sit there and shoot him. And so it made it really hard for either side to gain the upper hand. This was kind of a general idea of what a trench warfare would look like, at least on one side. So you had the front trench line, then you had support trenches with, machine gun nests, and then under here you might have it all dug out so that your people could retreat and get some rest. Then you had another trench line that this is far enough away from like the enemy's machine gun fire that you could actually bring new troops in, give them, unload them into that trench, then they could work their way through the trench until they got up to the front line trench. And then way back here you have your artillery. And you basically would have the same thing on the other side facing towards them. And then in between here was nothing. It was called no man's land because no man could live there. And so the first challenge, if you were going to try and make any headway in a war like this, was that you had to get out of your trench. Well, you had machine guns focused. I mean, you're level with the ground, so they basically just have to know where your trench is and then just focus their machine guns and watch all day for the first head that sticks up out of the trench, and then they shoot you. Yeah. It's like shooting fish in a barrel, literally. So they'd line you up and they'd be like, all right, we're going to all get out of here. They can't shoot us all. Wrong. They can shoot you all. But let's just say they couldn't. So you wait till some dense fog gets in so you try and sneak out and maybe you get out. And then you have to crawl across 100 yards or so of landmine infested, constantly being shot with artillery, exploding shells, things like that. And, these large exploding artillery shells would leave these huge craters. People would get hit, and they would. It was pretty terrible. So you had to cross no man's land, and then you'd get to the barbed wire. And if you get through the barbed wire, then you have to go and get to the other trench, right? And then when you got to the other trench, there was 10,000 guys waiting there with guns like this for the first person to stick their head over the top of their trench. So you had to have grenades, and you try and lob grenades in there, and then hopefully they didn't lob them back. Or you might have like a flamethrower, and if you got through there with a flamethrower, man, you could tear some folks up. You just cook them up in that trench, right? You also had the problem of airplanes are just kind of invented, and the first thing that we figure out is that we can drop bombs out of them, but not in the way you think, because they didn't have the mechanism to drop bombs out the bottom. So literally, if you were dropping bombs or anything out of an airplane, it was just sitting in your lap, and you would take it and you'd just be like, oh boy, right? You just literally drop them out the side of the plane as you fly over the trench and hope your plane doesn't get shot, or that you don't hit some turbulence or something like that and your plane gets rocked, or a bullet comes up and hits one of those bombs and just explodes you in the air. But nobody ever thought about this before. Oh, bombs from the air, great. So now you've dug a trench. You don't even really have anywhere to go. So if an airplane does fly over the trench, they just sit there and drop bombs into the trench and kill as many people as they want. You also have the invention of gas during this time, right? So you have airplanes, you have tanks that really show up later. Submarines show up eventually. Crazy machine guns, flamethrowers, all of these things are really, really incredibly powerful tools for killing that had never been seen before. Remember, it was less than probably 50 years ago that Napoleon and them are literally lining up across from each other and shooting at each other with guns. That was war. Now they're dropping bombs and rolling with tanks and flamethrowers and machine guns, right? It's insane. And so it's really going to end up being a very brutal and terrible war in terms of loss of life, one that has had no comparison in previous generations of humankind. Really, really bad. Like I said, you also had gas, another military technology, poison gas. The Germans were the first to develop that. It doesn't quite go as according to plan most of the time, though, because, again, the problem with Northern Europe is that it's very windy, it's lots of rain, so, you might fly over an airplane and drop a canister of gas, and it hits, and the wind shifts, and then it blows all the gas back on your troops and kills all your own people. That happened quite a bit. And we're talking about chlorine gas and mustard gas, stuff like that. And phosgene gas, and pretty devastating. Basically, it just destroyed your lung tissue and then you drown in your own blood. It basically just set your lungs on fire and destroyed all the tissue, and then you'd bleed out through your lungs and drown. You'd suffocate to death. And again, it was pretty crazy. It would make you go blind. It would just destroy any soft tissue that it got into. So your eyes, or like I said, if you breathed it in, it would just eviscerate your lungs, destroy any tissue. If it got on your skin, it would burn you. You were talking about terrible, terrible stuff. And so devastating technology for sure. So we have the invention of the gas mask. And you can see here two guys with their donkey, who they also had a gas mask for, because they don't want the donkey to get hurt. How else will they pull anything? Because remember, World War I, you have this dichotomy of it's a war fought with modern technology, but the modern technology is kind of emerging as the war goes on. You have the automobile, but Henry Ford doesn't really make them super, affordable until 1906, 1910. People are just now figuring it out, right? And so you have machine guns, you have artillery being pulled and supplied with horses. Literally. and then you have tanks, and then you have horses. And so it's pretty crazy. I mean, the most popular form of personal transportation at the time of World War I, does anybody want to take a guess what that was? Personal transportation, most popular form during World War I. No. The horse had actually been replaced for personal transportation. Cars were catching on, but the most popular was bicycles. People rode bicycles everywhere. There were people showing up to war on bikes, right? And they're showing up and getting run over by tanks. You get what I'm saying? Like, it's kind of this weird time frame where it's like we've figured out how to kill each other really well, but the rest of our everyday technology is still trying to catch up. So it was pretty crazy. As we said, on the Western Front, there's not a lot of momentum. Once you kind of dig in, it was very hard to displace somebody from their trench, because you might have a trench and then they could fall back to another trench and then another trench, and you had to kind of go through and fight. And if you could get across no man's land, you still had a pretty uphill battle even getting to the trench, right? And so it wasn't something where it was like, oh yeah, we can just push them out. We can't just cross this field. For 4 years, they basically didn't ever cross a single football field, for the most part. I mean, it's kind of crazy. There was pushes here and there, but for the most part, the Western Front didn't move very much. And it becomes a war of attrition. Now, you do have some times where, one group or another group says, hey, we're going to make a giant push. We're going to put, we're going to get 250,000 troops and we're going to just overwhelm them. They can't shoot all of us. They'll run out of bullets, right? And so places like Verdun, from February to December of 1916, you have the Battle of Verdun, where you have approximately 750,000 casualties. Now, that's about 11 months. I think we figured it out one day. It's like, so 11 months, 330 days, essentially. That's about 2,272 deaths per day for 11 months. That means that every hour about 95 people were killed for 11 months straight. 95 people for 11 months straight. The Somme, from July to November of 1916, over 1 million. You're talking about half the time, more people. That comes out like July. Let's just say that's half the year, right? So we're talking 6 months. Let's call it 180 days. Okay, so that's about 5,500 people a day. And that comes out to about 230 people an hour for 6 months straight. It's pretty crazy. And they just kept throwing and throwing and throwing and throwing and throwing people at this war and really making no headway at all. And so you could see that this is going to become a war of attrition, that they just say, we can't do anything about it. It does spread all around the world, the casualty rates, because it is world war, and you have all these European countries that are going to bring their imperial colonies into war with them. As we said, you have India, you have Indians that are showing up on bicycles and on horseback, and you have African troops that are going to be fighting for the Germans and stuff like this. And it's absolutely crazy that how much this is going to spread out and how much it's going to affect the entire world. You have new theaters of war, Africa, the Pacific, because German colonies are seized by Japan, Australia, New Zealand. The Ottoman Empire is actually going to align with Germany. And the U.S. and Latin America is actually going to try and stay pretty neutral. Now, the British really need help fighting against the Ottoman Empire. So what they actually do is they send this guy, T.E. Lawrence, who's a British military intelligence officer. And he'd been in the Middle East. He'd been living there for several years prior to the outbreak of the First World War. So he has these contacts in the Arab community, and he's going to basically send them out and try and convince them that they need to overthrow these Ottoman Turks that had been in control of their territory for so long. that they needed nationalism, that they should rise up against the Ottoman Turks, because if we could get the Ottoman Turks to go to war with the Arabs, then they couldn't help supply the Germans. And so the British make all these promises. Oh yeah, at the end of this war, we're going to give you independence and all of this stuff. Unfortunately, that doesn't end up working out that way. And we end up taking advantage of the Middle East once we discover that they have insane amounts of oil, which is one of the main reasons that we're going to have so many problems in the Middle East. It's going to be a result of what we end up doing after World War I. But this guy, Lawrence, there was a movie about him, Lawrence of Arabia. It was a very popular movie. I think it won like a bunch of Oscars and stuff. But it was about him. And it's really going to be, impactful later on after the war, what we try and get going there in the Middle East. On the home front, World War I is, kind of an opportunity for the government to kind of expand their power. Eventually, we are going to join, and because of that, we're going to really put out quite a bit of propaganda. Most of this is not American propaganda. Most of this is, German or Austrian or British propaganda posters to try and get people to come together. But the idea is, we're all in this together, this idea of total war, that there are no civilians anymore, that every single person in a country has to contribute for a war to be successful. And so you have this idea that essentially we're not going to just rely on the army. Everybody's involved. And that really does have some major consequences, because that means that everybody is a combatant and that nobody is safe from the impacts of this war. People get drafted. Whether you want to serve or not, it doesn't matter. And so this is going to bring a lot of more people into the war and open the door for more destruction and stuff like that. You have regulation of industry and food rationing and all these things that go into, backing the war. And so everything turns towards that. And that's why it becomes such a war of attrition, because one, it's really going to help the economies of a lot of these countries because they're spending a lot of money on war. But also it's going to harm them because everyone's involved, and it really does cost them quite a bit. Obviously, the U.S. Army is going to try and, get in on the game once we get in. They're going to censor views that we don't like. If you're saying things against, supporting the war, this government's going to come out and censor you eventually. We're going to put out these ideas that, the Germans are this, they're going to compare them to like big gorillas, that they're dangerous and that they've captured Lady Liberty here, and that you can see here the Germans are, bayoneting babies and stuff, and really trying to get an emotional response to get everybody involved in this. Again, just more examples of propaganda. This idea that, the Germans are saying, hey, we're doing a great job, we're winning. They're getting their people riled up and involved in this as well. Now, World War I does end up being an opportunity for some feminism on the home front. Women are going to get involved prior to World War I with some of these ideas, like getting the right to vote and stuff like this. But the war is actually going to provide women their biggest opportunity to move into the public sector in new ways, because they need women in these factories. They need all this stuff made because all the men are at war. So women are going to get a chance to kind of get out there and prove they're capable of being productive in society. They're capable of doing these important jobs. And it's going to open that door for them. You had a lot of ambulance drivers. You had a lot of women that are going to support the war effort by, making bombs, building ships, doing all of these things that women would have never had the opportunity to do before the war. And then, we've kind of just skimmed the surface here, but you do need to understand that World War I really sees the beginning of this, development of trench warfare, which is going to cause extremely high casualty rates. But it's also going to contribute to a new type of problem, which is psychological problems for those who survive. because of the horrors of bombings and gas and all these things that people would see in the trenches, you end up with a new term that's coined called shell-shocked, which is brand new because nobody had ever really been shell-shocked before. And what we know this as today is PTSD, war-induced PTSD, where, you weren't killed, but you had these atrocities that you witnessed that these bombs and stuff, and people would come home and people would, clap and they'd have flashbacks and stuff. And we really start to pay attention to some of that, this post-traumatic stress that's going to end up happening, and it becomes a major issue later on. And again, the other major thing is the move to total war had the unintended consequence of basically turning everyone into a military target. If you're supporting the war effort, you're a military target. And because we basically moved the entire society towards helping the military effort, everyone is military targets. And so you have some really, really terrible consequences there as well. And that's kind of how World War I kind of plays out and what it looks like in terms of getting everybody involved with it.